The year was 1996. It had been 5 years since the collapse of the USSR. The world was now unipolar, with the United States standing as the lone superpower. Even though it was a clear, decisive victory for the US and the capitalist bloc, this man just couldn't digest it. He couldn't stand the idea that the whole world could be controlled by just one country. He knew there must be a multipolar world. Sitting in his Soviet-style office, he was staring at the world map. The man was Yevgeny Primikov, Russia's foreign minister. On the map, he drew a triangle joining Russia, China, and India. Primikov knew that if Russia were to reclaim its lost control and counter American hegemony, it would have to form some sort of coalition or cooperation with these two rising giants. But it was complete nonsense. China and India had fought a full-scale, brutal border war in the 60s. Meanwhile, Russia also had major ideological tensions and border disputes with China. China was not India's friend, Russia was not China's friend, and here Primikov was fantasizing an alliance among them. Anyways, he worked hard, and he was somewhat successful in bringing at least China to normalize ties with Russia. But little did he know that his little triangle, combined with a series of events, would go on to become the most formidable challenge to US supremacy. Buckle up! It's one hell of a story. Initially, it was RIC, Russia, India, and China. But then, in 2001, an article was published titled Building Better Global Economic BRICS. The guy who wrote it was actually a well-established British economist at Goldman Sachs named Jim O'Neill. He argued that the world economy would soon be dominated by 4 emerging nations: Brazil, Russia, India, and China, and the rest was history. Russia quickly adopted the BRIC name and sent diplomats to these countries. Meanwhile, O'Neill's work had already made a huge impact in the relevant countries. These leaders realized the massive economic power they could gain by partnering together. Talks continued for a few years without anything materializing, and then, in 2006, during the annual UN General Assembly in New York, it finally happened. The 4 foreign ministers of Brazil, Russia, India, and China met privately in a high-stakes room. BRIC was finally formalized. Their goal was simple: to challenge the dominance of the G7 and the US dollar. Then, a few years later, in 2009, Russia hosted the first ever BRIC summit. The very next year, in 2010, South Africa was invited to join the group, adding the S in the BRICS. With Russia's oil and gas reserves, Brazil's agriculture, India's labor, and China's manufacturing, the bloc became a self-sustaining powerhouse that didn't need to rely on the US or Europe. In 2010, the BRICS nations represented nearly 42% of the world's population and 27% of global GDP. Their growth rate was 4 times the rate of the G7. But it was still far from being a threat to the US. To understand why, we need to go back in time. The era was post-World War II, and the UK and its European allies were in shambles. Even though the UK had won against Germany, the war had left behind massive infrastructure destruction. But on the other side of the Atlantic Ocean, there was the US, fully intact, with not even a single building destroyed, and an economy that had grown despite the war. Therefore, to rebuild Europe, it was the US that had to provide funds. To counter these economic issues, a historic conference was held in 1944. From this meeting, the Bretton Woods system was born. Under this new order, European nations pegged their currencies to the US dollar, while the dollar itself was pegged to gold. In total, 44 allied nations agreed to the deal. To support global recovery, 2 major institutions were created: the International Monetary Fund, IMF, and the World Bank. Because these bodies provided loans primarily in dollars, it gave the American currency a massive authoritative edge over the rest of the world. The dollar had become the world's reserve currency and the go-to currency for international trade. For 3 decades, the dollar was linked to gold, while other world currencies were linked directly to the dollar. But in the 70s, the US started a money pit war against Vietnam. The US was losing around $170 million per day. It was an extremely expensive war, and the US needed dollars, its own currency. And well, they quietly unlinked the dollar to gold and just printed their currency as much as they wanted. Eventually, the whole Bretton Woods system collapsed to the ground. Now you'd guess it was the time the dollar would also collapse, but in the world of currencies, it doesn't happen this quickly or easily. You see, the first ever currency that became the dominant international reserve currency was the Dutch guilder. Once it reached the top, it remained there for over 100 years, but after constant, expensive wars and defeats, the UK's pound became the top currency, and it held the throne for over 150 years, stretching from the 19th century to the aftermath of World War II. The pattern is clear. Once a currency claims the global throne, it requires a catastrophe beyond imagination to topple it. Since the dollar had claimed the throne of the global economy, it became so dominant and widely trusted that it started to be seen as gold itself. Eventually, the American currency grew so powerful that it no longer needed the physical backing of gold bars in a vault. The dollar was the new gold. So, in 2010, when the BRICS nations emerged as an economic coalition, it posed no threat to America or its currency. But things were about to change. In 2014, BRICS came up with their own version of the World Bank, called the New Development Bank. Its purpose was to fund infrastructure and development projects in partner nations, but with less strict political and economic conditions. Although it was no match against the massive scale of the World Bank, it still was something, and the potential was unquestionable. During this time, the world witnessed some serious economic shifts. In a historic move, China's own currency, the yuan, surpassed the euro to become the second most used currency in global trade. At the same time, Brazil's trade priorities flipped. Once dependent on the US market, Brazil now exported 4 times as much to China as it did to the United States. By 2018, the BRICS had evolved into a massive pool with over $20 trillion of GDP. These nations combined were housing roughly 41% of the world's population. The very next year, it surpassed the GDP of the rival G7. It was turning into something the US and the West just can't ignore now. In the following years, as its GDP and population grew even larger, it gained even greater political might. The more political might it gained, the more popular it became among nations, and thus, more countries started to show interest in joining a club that was fundamentally created to kill the US hegemony. Then, something happened that shocked the world. Russia invaded Ukraine. As the world was busy opposing Moscow, the US took one extra step and froze Russia's $300 billion in foreign reserves. It sent a shockwave through every central bank in the world. Suddenly, the world's trust in the US dollar was broken. It made them question, what if they did something the US didn't like? Would their foreign reserves be gone just because of the hegemon's will? Nations started looking for alternatives. By the end of 2023, more than 40 countries had expressed their interest in joining the bloc. Among them, 4 nations, namely UAE, Iran, Egypt, and Ethiopia, formally joined the alliance. It was a major setback for the US empire. Then came Donald Trump's second term. I would call it less of a presidency and more of a masterclass in global bullying. He started quite literally weaponizing the dollar against foreign economies. In 2025, he rolled out an idea he deemed very great, the tariffs. China was hit with a whooping 245%, India and Brazil with 50%, South Africa with 30%, and any country doing trade with Iran, 25%. Trump thought these BRICS nations would give up their ambitions, but what happened was quite the opposite. It brought the nation even closer to each other. They started looking at each other's markets as a priority instead of the US. By the end of the very same year, intra-BRICS trade turnover officially surpassed $1 trillion. The factory, the American car manufacturer Ford had abandoned in Brazil, was taken over by BYD, a Chinese EV manufacturer. The roads that were flooded by American cars were being flooded by Chinese cars. The US administration explicitly threatened 100% tariffs on any country that attempted to replace the dollar with a new BRICS currency. Rather than backing down, BRICS members, specifically India, China, and Brazil, simply started doing local currency settlements. By trading in rupees, yuan, and reais, they bypassed the US banking system entirely, making the tariffs harder to enforce on invisible, non-dollar transactions. As of 2026, the bloc has proposed a currency of its own for international trade, the unit, a gold-backed digital currency. If materialized, it would be a direct threat to the US and its weaponized dollar. And as for the new development bank, as of writing this script, it has approved 139 projects totaling roughly 43 billion US dollars, focusing on sustainable infrastructure, clean energy, and transport across BRICS and other developing nations. While about two-thirds of financing has been in US dollars, the bank aims to have 30% of its loans in local currencies. De-dollarization is the single greatest threat to the United States. The US can afford a $1 trillion military only because of its currency's global status. It can borrow as much as it wants without worrying about interest rates solely because of the dollar's dominance. This weaponized currency provides the leverage to pressure and bully other nations through sanctions and tariffs without any consequences. When a massive corporation goes bankrupt, the US can fund their bailouts simply because it can print money at will. If the dollar's supremacy ends, America will face an economic crisis unlike anything it has ever experienced. For the US, BRICS poses a more imminent threat than any nuke sitting in North Korea. I hope you enjoyed this take on a geopolitical topic. If you did, make sure to give a big thumbs up. This channel is dedicated to bringing you stories that are worth your time. If you appreciate deep researched content like this, make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell. Thank you for watching until the very end. See you in the next one. Bye.